Hello everyone, and here are the details of today's video. France's increasingly confrontational posture toward President Vladimir Putin is not simply a matter of geopolitical alignment or moral outrage. It is more fundamentally the expression of a deeper structural anxiety, a realization in Paris that the pillars sustaining France's global influence are eroding. Macron's anti-Putin stance, sharp and uncompromising, reflects a nation confronting the limits of its power in a rapidly changing world. To understand France's hostility toward Russia, one must begin with a simple truth. France's influence has long exceeded its material weight. Its global role was never derived from industrial dominance or demographic scale, but from three sources of leverage that magnified its strategic presence: its nuclear energy and technological leadership, its military and political footprint across Africa, and its central role in defining Europe's foreign policy narrative. Each of these pillars is now under strain, and Russia plays a critical role in this unraveling. For decades, Africa served as France's geopolitical anchor. Through military bases, energy contracts, and political alliances, Paris maintained a sphere of influence that provided economic returns and strategic prestige. But Russia's re-entry into Africa, offering security partnerships without Western conditionality, has dramatically altered the landscape. Nations that once depended on French protection are now turning to Moscow. The result is not just a loss of contracts or military access. It is a blow to the very foundation of France's post-colonial identity. Macron perceives Putin as the architect of this shift, a leader dismantling French influence not through ideology, but through pragmatic engagement with governments disillusioned by Europe's claims of moral authority. The challenge is existential. Russia's rise in Africa shrinks France's global stature, undermines its energy security, and threatens its claim to leadership within Europe. Domestic fragility amplifies this anxiety. Macron governs a country struggling with economic stagnation, deep social unrest, and a public increasingly skeptical of European commitments. In such an environment, projecting strength abroad becomes a tool for compensating for weakness at home. Confronting Putin offers Macron a narrative of purpose, moral clarity, and continental leadership at a time when France's internal cohesion is fraying. In this sense, Macron's anti-Putin stance is less about Russia's behavior than about France's trajectory. It reflects not confidence, but fear, not dominance, but decline. France is grappling with a world in which its traditional sources of influence no longer carry the same weight. And in that world, opposing Russia becomes a way to assert relevance, even as the structural forces diminishing French power continue to accelerate. For more than half a century, Africa has functioned as the hidden architecture of French power, a vast geopolitical reservoir that extended Paris influence far beyond Europe's borders. While France's economy and population were modest compared with other great powers, its military bases in the Sahel, its privileged access to African minerals, and its tight financial networks through the CFA franc zone allowed Paris to operate as a global actor disproportionate to its size. Africa was not merely a partner to France, it was a pillar of French identity, strategy, and economic security. But the last decade has witnessed a dramatic unraveling of this foundation, and Russia stands at the center of the transformation. Moscow's return to Africa has been marked not by ideological confrontation, but by a pragmatic offer that resonates deeply with governments weary of Western paternalism, security assistance without political lectures, economic cooperation without conditionality, and diplomatic support without moralizing. In countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic, Russia has presented itself as a counterweight to France's long-standing dominance. This has triggered a geopolitical earthquake. What troubles Paris most is not simply that influence is slipping away, but that it is being replaced by a rival that challenges the French model at its core. Russia's growing presence threatens French access to uranium deposits in Niger, resources that have historically powered France's nuclear energy system, the backbone of its electricity grid, and a symbol of its technological pride. Losing this access jeopardizes France's energy sovereignty and its ability to maintain its role as Europe's nuclear leader. Moreover, Russia's security partnerships expose the fragility of France's military footprint. Once hailed as the indispensable stabilizer of the Sahel, France now finds itself expelled or marginalized across the region. This loss weakens France's claim to leadership within the European Union, where Paris once positioned itself as the continent's expert on African affairs and crisis management. In the eyes of the French establishment, Russia is not merely a competitor, it is an agent accelerating the collapse of a system that sustained French global relevance for decades. Africa's shifting alliances reveal a deeper truth. The post-colonial order Paris depended upon is no longer accepted, no longer stable, and no longer defensible. Thus, Macron's hostility toward Russia is intertwined with the erosion of France's strategic model in Africa. Moscow is not simply encroaching on French interests, it is reshaping a geopolitical landscape that Paris once believed immutable. And in doing so, Russia exposes the fragility of France's global posture in a world where old hierarchies no longer endure. France's external assertiveness toward Russia cannot be divorced from the profound fragilities brewing inside the French Republic itself. Emmanuel Macron governs a nation unsettled, one wrestling with structural economic stagnation, widening social inequality, and a political fabric stretched thin by polarization. The France of today is not the confident middle power of decades past. It is a nation searching for coherence in the face of recurring domestic upheavals. In such an environment, foreign policy becomes not merely an outward projection of national interest, but a mirror reflecting internal weakness. Macron's presidency has been marked by crises that expose the fragility of French society. The Gilets jaunes uprising revealed deep resentment among working and middle-class citizens who felt abandoned by Parisian elites. And it permits him to reassert presidential authority by anchoring domestic debates within a narrative of global consequence. Portraying Russia as a looming danger to European stability helps Macron justify increased military spending, tighter strategic alignment within the EU, and a leadership role in shaping Europe's stance toward Moscow. This outward posture compensates for political vulnerability at home. It creates the image of a France that is principled, decisive, and indispensable qualities increasingly questioned within French borders. But this is also a risky strategy. Externalizing political legitimacy can generate short-term unity, but often masks unresolved structural issues. Macron's anti-Putin narrative resonates in Brussels and Berlin, but is less compelling to citizens facing inflation, falling wages, and social fragmentation. and it permits him to reassert presidential authority by anchoring domestic debates within a narrative of global consequence. Portraying Russia as a looming danger to European stability helps Macron justify increased military spending, tighter strategic alignment within the EU, and a leadership role in shaping Europe's stance toward Moscow. This outward posture compensates for political vulnerability at home. It creates the image of a France that is principled, decisive, and indispensable qualities increasingly questioned within French borders. But this is also a risky strategy. Externalizing political legitimacy can generate short-term unity, but often masks unresolved structural issues. Macron's anti-Putin narrative resonates in Brussels and Berlin, but is less compelling to citizens facing inflation, falling wages, and social fragmentation. Foreign policy cannot indefinitely substitute for domestic solutions. Still, Macron's calculation is clear. In moments of national uncertainty, a formidable external adversary helps consolidate the role of the state and the authority of its leader. By casting France as a bulwark against Russian influence, Macron is not just shaping Europe's geopolitical posture, he is attempting to reclaim the narrative of French leadership at a time when its foundations are under strain. At the heart of the tension between Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin lies not merely a clash of national interests, but a collision of worldviews, two philosophical visions of global order that increasingly diverge as the post-Cold War consensus dissolves. France, still anchored in its self-conception as a guardian of European ideals, champions a universalist project rooted in values, norms, and the belief that the West's political model remains history's natural endpoint. Russia, by contrast, advances a worldview built on sovereignty, civilizational autonomy, and resistance to what it perceives as the moral overreach of Western power. Macron's France stands firmly within the European tradition that emerged after 1945. The idea that Europe, through its institutions and normative frameworks, represents a model for global governance. In this vision, the rules-based international order is not simply a diplomatic architecture, but a moral hierarchy, one in which Europe plays the role of standard setter and guardian. Macron sees France as the spiritual core of this mission, a nation uniquely positioned to articulate Europe's responsibilities in defending democracy, humanitarian principles, and political liberalism. Putin rejects this worldview outright. Russia's philosophy, articulated over 2 decades, insists that each nation has the sovereign right to determine its own political and cultural destiny, free from Western judgment. Moscow argues that Europe's universalism is a veneer masking geopolitical self-interest, a continuation of the same paternalism that once shaped Africa and the Middle East. Where Macron sees values, Putin sees interference. The conflict, therefore, is not only geopolitical, it is metaphysical. It is a struggle over who gets to define legitimacy, who writes the global narrative, and whether the future belongs to a single universal model or a mosaic of sovereign civilizations. Macron and Putin stand on opposite sides of this philosophical divide, each defending not just national interests, but competing visions of how humanity should organize itself. This is why the relationship cannot be stabilized through simple diplomacy. The dispute is foundational, rooted in incompatible conceptions of power, identity, and the purpose of the state. France today stands at a crossroads between a world that once was and a world that is rapidly emerging. For decades, Paris wielded influence far beyond its economic size, anchored in its African sphere of influence, its nuclear industry, and its moral authority within Europe. Yet each of these pillars is weakening, not because of a single adversary, but because the global system that sustained France's prominence is dissolving. Russia's ascent in Africa, China's rise, shifting energy markets, and the growing assertiveness of the global South all reveal a structural truth. The old order that privileged Europe is fading. Macron's escalating confrontation with Putin is, in many ways, an attempt to preserve the architecture of that older world. By portraying France as a defender of European values and global norms, he seeks to uphold a narrative in which Europe retains the right to shape international affairs. But narratives cannot hold when the material foundations underneath them erode. As African nations expel French troops, renegotiate old dependencies, and turn to new partners, the moral authority France relies on appears increasingly hollow. What France must confront is not merely a geopolitical rival, but the transformation of global agency. Nations once subordinated to European influence now demand equality and find in Russia, China, and others a counterbalance to Western dominance. In this emerging multipolar environment, France's traditional posture of leadership looks less like stewardship and more like nostalgia. To remain relevant, France must abandon the reflex to moralize and embrace a diplomacy rooted in partnership rather than hierarchy. It must reimagine its role within Europe, not as the continent's conscience, but as one participant among many in a pluralistic world. And it must accept that Africa, long treated as an extension of French strategy, is moving irreversibly toward autonomy. Whether France adapts to this new reality will determine its future. Macron's hostility toward Russia may offer short-term political clarity, but the deeper challenge is existential. Can France evolve beyond the structures of a bygone age, or will it cling to them until its influence fades entirely?